Thanks so much for tuning in. Today, I would like to talk to you a little bit about critical race theory. So, critical race theory emerged in law schools in the 1970s and 1980s. The prevailing sense in the legal academy in the US at the time was that the law was not at all involved in creating and sustaining racial hierarchies. Indeed, prior to the emergence of critical race theory, most people in the legal academy in the US had embraced the idea that notions of fairness, equality, and justice guided the law. Most legal academics found it difficult to contemplate that the law could be involved in creating a society that, racially speaking, is unfair, unjust, and unequal. The intellectual forefather of critical race theory, Professor Derek Bell, was one of the first to challenge this view. Professor Bell was the first Black tenured professor at Harvard Law School. He devoted his scholarship and his life to exploring how it came to be that Black people remained at the bottom of practically every measure of social well-being, even though the civil rights movement had happened and there were a whole bunch of laws on the books that ostensibly were designed to end Black people's subordination. Bell concluded that racial inequality endured in a post-civil rights era because, among other things, the vision of racial justice that civil rights lawyers had championed was a weak and impoverished one. The result was that the civil rights laws that had been passed reflected this weak and impoverished vision of racial justice. Bell concluded that if racial inequality persisted in a post-civil rights era, then the law was central to explaining that persistence. Bell's scholarship, along with the writings of others, eventually coalesced into critical race theory. Today, critical race theory is an intellectual movement, it is a body of scholarship, and it is an analytical tool set for interrogating the relationship between law and racial inequality. Scholars who have reflected on the framework acknowledge that there are a host of different approaches, ideas, and trajectories within the body of work that may be called CRT. As Professor Jerome McChrystal Culp puts it, there is no critical race theory. Instead, there are critical race theories. There are many theories that unite and divide everyone who could be accused of being or claim to be members of the critical race theory movement. The one thing, perhaps the only thing that all of these folks have in common is the belief in opposition to oppression. Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term critical race theory, would agree. She describes CRT as fundamentally eclectic. And she has argued that although it has achieved some intellectual coherence, it is far from a fully unified school of thought. She asserts that CRT is not a noun, but rather it is a verb, an entity that shifts as it interacts with its environment. In some sense, then, CRT might simply be a political position. It might simply be a location from which a critique of the prevailing racial order might be launched. That said, simply expressing a dissatisfaction with the existing racial order is not enough to make a piece of scholarship a part of the CRT tradition. It seems fair to say that in order for something to be appropriately described as CRT, it has to embrace or at least be consistent with a couple of basic ideas. But what are these ideas? Scholars have schematized CRT's foundational commitments in different ways. Some identify 2 essential tenets, others identify 8 or more. I personally identify 4, and I'll tell you about those right now. The first essential tenet of CRT is that CRT believes that race is not a biological entity, but rather is a social construction. Scholars working within the CRT paradigm deny that race is a genetic entity. Indeed, they deny that race is natural in any sense of the word. Nevertheless, race has persevered. Legal scholars working within the CRT framework take it as their charge to examine the role that law plays in that perseverance. So the body of work that can be referred to as CRT scholarship is united by the questions that it asks about the law's role in constructing race. Those questions include: how exactly does the law fabricate race? How has the law protected racism? How does the law reproduce racial inequality? And how can the law be used to dismantle racism, and racial inequality? Note that these questions all suggest that law is part and parcel of the racial order. CRT assumes that the law is not merely regulating race and the relations between the various races, rather the law is actively constituting race and the relations between the various races. Thus, if white people enjoy racial dominance and people of color are subordinate, CRT argues that the law has produced that very state of affairs. It is also important to note that while CRT scholarship might be joined by the questions that it asks about the law, it is not joined by the answers that it gives. There is no CRT solution to what CRT takes to be the US's race problem. Now, while CRT scholarship might disagree about how to solve the problems that it identifies, it is uncompromising in its belief that there is a problem, which leads to the second of CRT's essential tenets. CRT believes that there is a race problem in the US and that racism is a normal feature of American life and society. Now, when CRT proposes that racism is a normal feature of American society, it is saying that racism is the rule rather than the exception. It means that we should not understand acts of racism or the processes that produce racial hierarchy to be deviations from an otherwise fair and just status quo. Rather, the rule is one of racial unfairness and racial injustice. Racial fairness and racial justice, then, are exceptions to the general rule. I'll elaborate on this essential tenet in a bit. Third, CRT believes that scholarship is not, cannot, and should not be disconnected from people's lives on the ground. Thinkers using a CRT framework produce their scholarship with the hope of dismantling systems that subordinate people of color. CRT believes that all knowledge is political. It believes that scholarship that ignores race is not demonstrating objectivity or neutrality. Instead, in a lot of cases, scholarship that ignores race is demonstrating its own political commitments to the existing racial order. Thus, CRT is dedicated to the production of politically engaged scholarship. It allows race to figure centrally in its analyses, and it rejects the criticism that this is an analytical error. CRT argues that when race figures centrally in scholarship, it allows us to see how racial hierarchies are reflected in and reproduced by areas of law that are obviously about race, right? Like affirmative action or the criminal legal system or immigration. But when race figures centrally in legal scholarship, it allows us to see how racial hierarchies are reflected in and reproduced by areas of law that seemingly have nothing to do with race, like our tax code, or like our securities laws, or our land use laws, or intellectual property laws, and so on and so forth. And finally, CRT rejects traditional liberal understandings of the problem of racism and how racism will be defeated. CRT is convinced that liberal understandings of racism are deficient. It is convinced that this deficiency partially explains why racial inequality persists well after the civil rights movement achieved so many significant triumphs in the 1960s. I'm going to elaborate on this for just a little bit. At the time of CRT's emergence in law schools in the 1980s, many liberals perceived the country to be in the midst of a retreat from the commitment to racial justice that the civil rights movement had seemingly forced the nation to make. Then President Ronald Reagan had filled the federal judiciary with politically conservative judges who handed down exceedingly narrow interpretations of the newly minted civil rights laws. These interpretations drastically limited the reach and effect of the civil rights laws. Moreover, Reagan appointed individuals who were hostile to racial justice reforms to head the agencies charged with implementing and enforcing civil rights laws. In this way, the political climate at the time of CRT's emergence was one in which the limits of the civil rights laws were becoming crystal clear. CRT endeavored to analyze the origins of these limits, and it concluded quite controversially that the source of the inefficacy and inadequacy of civil rights laws was not a conservative judiciary and executive branch. Instead, CRT argued that the source was liberal civil rights discourse itself. CRT's willingness to lay blame for the frustration of liberals' racial justice goals with liberals might be that which has earned CRT its radical label. While CRT certainly critiqued conservative judges and politicians, it also critiqued the liberal understandings of race, racism, and racial justice that were embodied in civil rights laws. These were reformist and integration-oriented laws that liberals had fought for, championed, and continued to defend. CRT argued that conservatism was part and parcel of the way that liberals thought about and talked about racism and racial equality. And CRT claimed that this conservatism explained why it was so easy for conservatives to co-opt the language of civil rights to limit the scope of the civil rights laws. CRT identified a whole bunch of areas where the traditional liberal discourse around race was conservative, but I'll just tell you about one. And that one is the definition of racism. Traditional liberal civil rights discourse tends to define racism as discrete, easily identifiable, invariably intentional, always irrational acts that are perpetrated by bad actors. Let's unpack this definition a little bit. If acts of racism are discrete, it means that they are cut off and isolated from other acts, individuals, and institutions. If acts of racism are easily identifiable, it means that recognizing the mechanisms that disadvantage individuals and or groups on account of race is straightforward, unambiguous, and involves no great effort or theory. If acts of racism are intentional, it means that the actor who engages in the racist behavior purposefully disadvantages an individual because of her race. Indeed, disadvantaging the individual because of her race is the actor's sole or primary reason for engaging in the racist behavior. If acts of racism are irrational, it means that it doesn't make sense for the racist person to do them. And finally, if acts of racism are perpetrated by bad actors, it means that when we are trying to figure out how to dismantle racial hierarchies, we need to be on the lookout for culpable individuals. It means that we can safely ignore the structures within which individuals exist. It means that we can safely ignore the institutions that operate within society. Essentially, traditional civil rights discourse defines racism as individually held bias or prejudice. Traditional liberal civil rights discourse defines racism as bigotry. CRT proposes that this definition of racism is woefully inadequate. While defining racism as discrete, identifiable, intentional, irrational acts perpetrated by bad actors, while that might describe a type of racism that may have been ubiquitous in the pre-civil rights era, and while it might describe a type of racism that tenaciously persists today, CRT argues that it does not describe the mechanisms that do most of the work of maintaining white people as the dominant racial group in this country at present. CRT contends that far from being discrete and cut off, racism and racial dominance are oftentimes the result of the interactions of many institutions across multiple domains. CRT claims that far from being easily identifiable, racism and the recognition of an act or omission as a species of racism, that frequently requires a theoretical framework to help us figure out which societal choices inflict racial subordination and consequently ought to be designated as racism. CRT proposes that racism is not invariably intentional. In the post-civil rights era, racism is oftentimes the unintended, if foreseeable, consequence of choices that we make. CRT also denies that racism is unvaryingly irrational. It posits that more often than not, racism makes all the sense in the world. It helps to protect wealth. It helps to protect privilege. It helps to protect power. Finally, CRT argues that while racism may be perpetrated by bad actors, it more frequently is the result of institutional, structural processes in the post-civil rights era. CRT offers that defining racism in the way that traditional civil rights discourse proposes, it's problematic. When racism is only understood as bias or prejudice or bigotry practiced by a bad actor, it puts outside of the field of vision all of the institutions and structures that function to maintain the US's current racial hierarchy. And so that is a very short explanation of critical race theory. It's a very complex theory. It's a very advanced legal theory. And so when folks propose that critical race theory is being taught in kindergarten, or when folks propose that critical race theory offers some simple explanation of society, like critical race theory proposes that all white people are racist, and that the US is fundamentally and irredeemably racist. That's simple. It's also incorrect. CRT proposes none of those things. And so I encourage you to learn more about critical race theory, and I hope this video is a nice beginning. Thanks so much.